That personnel selection and really retention, is a huge key to organizational effectiveness. The the use of validated selection criteria is important not only for equal employment law, but it's also important that you hire people that are able to do the job correctly and well. Um, Selection includes the entire process, includes applications, reference checking, any kind of testing, um, medical exams, interviewing. So the whole process is considered personnel selection, and we will talk about that. The process of selection is the process of gathering and assessing information about candidates to make personnel decisions, to make selection decisions. Um, there are a number of steps. Some of them are covered in other chapters. One is to perform job analysis and HR planning. Those are the previous chapters. You need to know what the job is and what the specifications are so that you can find someone to fill it. You also need to know when to look and for how many to look for, and that's part of the HR planning process. Recruitment strategy is the strategy that builds a selection pool, a group of people that you select from. Um, and then this chapter really deals with developing selection procedures, validating them, and then determine any kind of weighting system, whether you have a multiple hurdle system or a single selection method. Well, almost all companies have multiple hurdles. They do an interview, they'll do an application or a resume, and then they'll do an interview in HR, and then a manager interview, and maybe some testing or medical exams. But it's almost always a multiple hurdle system. Now, one of the things we need to talk about before we get too far into the methods is just the concept of reliability and validity. Um, if you remember from EEO that if a person could prove a prima facie case, in other words, show underutilization of minorities, then the burden of proof shifted to the company, and the company had to prove that job-related grounds that they made their decision with. They had to prove that they weren't making decisions on race, color, sex, religion, national origin, etc. And so that's really the concept of showing that a test is reliable and valid to measure job performance. And what valid really means is truth. That's what the word means. And so a valid test measures what it purports to measure. And so in personnel selection, what we really only need is a test that's reliable. It measures the same thing every time, and it's valid. It measures what it purports to measure. If it's a test measuring intelligence, it actually measures intelligence, not processing speed or the language the test was done in. The reason that we only need reliability and validity goes back to the levels of measurement. There are 4 levels of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. You might have remembered this from statistics class, but probably not. But nominal measurement is just putting things in piles, putting all the women in one pile and all the men in another pile. That's nominal measurement. As long as you can separate men from women, you can do that. Ordinal measurement is lining people up from good to best. And so if you were to line everybody up on height, you could pretty reasonably do that. You might have to stand everybody else up against everybody else, but you could eventually get a group of 30 or 40 people lined up by height, and that would be ordinal measurement. Interval measurement assumes nominal and ordinal. It assumes that you can put people in piles, you can order them, but it also assumes that you know the difference between a 1 and a 2. An example of interval measurement is a yardstick. You can throw things in piles, inches. You know what an inch is. You can order them. 1 inch is smaller than 2 inches, which is smaller than 3 inches. And you know that the difference between 1 and 2 is exactly the same as the difference between 2 and 3, and 3 and 4, and 4 and 5, 1 inch. And so that makes it an interval scale. A ratio scale requires all those things. It's an interval scale, but it has a set 0 point. There are very few things in personnel that you would ever measure with a ratio scale. Height and mass are just about it. You can have an absence of height, an absence of mass, but almost everything you can imagine selecting someone on for job qualifications, you wouldn't need ratio measurement. And for the most cases, we don't need interval measurement. We usually are accepting one pile of people, those who apply and are willing to work for you, and we would use whatever method we would use to order those people and pick the best person. And so if you do that, all you really need is ordinal measurement. You don't even need interval measurement. The only reason you would need interval measurement if you were going across selection pools or administrations of a test or something. We need interval measurement if we were going to choose people on their GMAT scores or their SAT scores or something like that, because people take those tests all over the country, different administrations, and we need to have some way of comparing and making sure that a score from one administration of that test is equal to the score of another administration of that test. We do that by forcing a centralized mean and standard deviation. That's how that's done with standardized testing. We standardize the mean and the standard deviation, but it's based on interval measurement. We're assuming interval measurement. We force the mean and the standard deviation, and we can choose people from all over the country based on SAT scores. But rarely is that done in organizations for selection. We usually have one group of people applying one time for one job, and we simply interview all of them, put them in order, pick the best person. All that requires is ordinal measurement. Why that translates into reliability and validity is, again, the only things required for ordinal measurement is that the selection instrument be reliable and that it be valid. It measures what it purports to measure. If you can do that, you can line people up and pick the very best one. So that's the whole concept behind that discussion. Validity in the case of selection comes in different flavors. That when you talk about test validity, and that's usually what this is called, though it's not just for testing. You really have three kinds of validity. You have criterion-related validity. It's a statistical argument. And there are two kinds. One is predictive and one is concurrent. Predictive is I measure the predictor, the test, and then I wait a while and I measure the criterion. That's job performance. And so that because of that, it's predictive. Concurrently, as I measure both of those the same way, the same time. And so I would measure the predictor and I'd measure the job performance in the same day. And that's concurrent concurrent validity. Now, we're not required in this course to go read the Uniform Guidelines for Selection, big, huge document that have been referred to, that tell us how to validate and prove the job relatedness of tests. One of the things you'll find if you did read that document is that the EEOC does not favor concurrent validity. And the reason is that it would accept a lower number of minorities. If you take concurrent validity, what you've done is you've already eliminated people. When people come into the job, they either don't get it, they're not accepted, or they come in and they quit and they leave. And so what you have is a shrunken sample for validity. than what you would have if you did predictive validity. With predictive validity, you have your entire selection pool. With concurrent validity, you only have those people that survived. They got into the job, they did it well, they weren't fired, they didn't leave. And so predictive validity gives a lower cutoff score and would accept more minorities. So predictive validity makes more sense and is what is allowed by the EEOC. The other type of validity is called content validity, and it's a logical argument. Basically, you need to know the universe of what you're measuring. You have to sample from that universe. And then you have to show that the sample is representative of the universe. And that's what a professor would do if we were to write a test for you on reading a chapter. We'd say, okay, the chapter is the universe, and here are the test questions. Do these 10 test questions tap every major concept in that chapter? If they do, then this test is content valid. And you could actually do a matrix and show that graphically, but it is a logical argument. So in all testing at the personnel level, you're either going to really either do predictive validity. You measure the predictor, whether it's a test or an interview or whatever, an application blank, a resume, and then you're going to measure job performance later on, and you're going to correlate the two. The higher the correlation, the higher the validity. And in content validity, you would just show logically that your test is a representative sample of the universe of the job that comes from the job analysis. So you can see that you need the job analysis to define the job. You need to develop a selection procedure that probably doesn't cause adverse impact. And then you need to show that they are connected, that the test actually predicts job performance or is a representative sample of job performance. There's a couple other things that are important in validity. Validity generalization invokes evidence from past studies or studies in other companies. It is only allowed if you use a meta-analysis, which is a statistical technique. You don't need to know that, but you really can use validity from other organizations, but it has to be statistically proven. That your HR officer or a consultant's going to take care of that stuff. All this validity stuff is going to be taken care of by a consultant, probably. Even your HR officer is not going to do it unless it's content validity. The final issue that's discussed is utility. And there's another one I'm going to talk to you about too, and that's differential validity. Let's do that first before I forget it. Differential validity is predictive or concurrent validity, but it differentially predicts by a protected class. In other words, there's a different validity for whites than there is for African Americans or Hispanics or whatever, males and females. It used to be back before 1991, the law changed in that year, that you could actually correct for differential validity. You could add a score or subtract a score and make the two the same. Nowadays, you cannot do that. Differential validity is essentially not allowed. You have to start over again and create a test that doesn't cause differential validity. Utility is pretty much what it is. Utility is an economic gain by using a particular selection method or a particular cutoff score on a selection method. You actually would, or your HR officer would actually develop tables to show utility with different kinds of instruments and different cutoff scores on the different instruments. And it's nothing more than a utility, or a cost-benefit analysis. At this cutoff, I'm going to accept this number of people, and it's going to cost me this amount per interview, per hire. It can be figured out a lot of different ways, but you're almost always going to figure out the utility. You can create a gold-plated selection system that does a really good job of selecting, but it may cost so much that it's not worth doing for any particular job. Now, obviously, when you get into the higher level executive jobs and physicians and things like that, just about any cost is justified, and they are. because the cost of mistake is huge in those kinds of jobs. People die. And so you will hear discussion of utility. Becomes important. You can also look at utility, and it is discussed, I think, in your selection, in your textbook, and you can look at the utility of error rates. Again, going back to your statistics course, you know that when you're doing a selection, it's essentially a dichotomous decision. I'm either going to select somebody or I'm not. You have a 2 by 2 table. And on the one side, it's what I decided to do. I decided to select, or I decided to not select. And then on the other axis is truth. My decision was correct or my decision was not correct. Those are really type 1 and type 2 error rates. Falsely saying someone was I can't remember which is which, but falsely saying that someone was an acceptable employee, I think is type 1, and then falsely saying that an employee should be rejected is type 2 error. The issue is that of that 2 by 2 box, there's 4 boxes. 2 of them are correct. You said a person was good and you hired them. And the other was you said they were not good and you did not hire them. The other 2 are errors. You said they were good and you did not hire them, or you said they were bad and you did hire them. And so you can actually draw those tables up statistically, and you can show the utility of different cutoff scores on a test and what the error rates would be on that test. I'm not going to show you how to do it at this point. There is some discussion in your textbook. Most HR officers know how to do it. All consultants on testing do. But just remember that you don't want error if you can avoid it. Higher validity tests will wipe out both kinds of error. But if you have to have error, it depends upon the job. If you're hiring a physician, you don't want to falsely hire someone who is incompetent. And so you want to wipe that error out. You would do almost anything to not hire someone who is incompetent. On the other hand, if you're hiring somebody to clean rooms or something and you put them on a probationary period where you can watch them and the mistakes are not deadly, then you can accept a larger error rate where you've taken people in that can't do the job, because you can get rid of them easily enough, and they won't kill anybody particularly. It might cause an infection, which is not good. But you see what I mean. It's that the error rate that you're willing to accept depends upon the criticality of the job. And so that's why you would sit down and you do a utility chart based on error rates, and then that gets done. So let's talk about the different methods. I'm going to skip over a lot of them fairly quickly. Just give you the highlights. You can read the textbook. Application blanks and biographical data. Most organizations do an application nowadays, some an application and a resume. The nice thing about application blanks and a biographical data form where you just fill out information about yourself is that they can be weighted and scored. And so that's interesting. It's not used very often anymore, but it used to. The reason it's not used very much anymore is because it can cause disparate impact, and it leads to an argument, a prima facie case of discrimination. And so most people don't use tightly scored biographical forms or application blanks. They use it as a first step to look at skills and competencies, but they don't start scoring it. Reference checking and background checks, almost all companies do it. They Google applicants, they check their credit scores, they call up references. There's a lot of fear of lawsuits and claims of negligent hiring, particularly with physicians. And so you're going to find reference checking and background checking, particularly with licensed employees, nurses and physicians. The problem is that former employers are reluctant to provide information, but it depends on how you ask. You can ask, would you rehire this person, and they can say that legally, without too much ramifications if there's any issues. Um, Companies have been sued for not being honest regarding former employees, particularly with physicians, where you're trying to pass an incompetent physician off and they lie and say, well, this guy's great. And then it turns out to not be great. Um, those hospitals have sued the previous institution for not being honest in evaluating that candidate when asked for a reference. Probably 25% of applications over and above the high end are reference checked and background checked. But it's getting so easy with all the information online and with credit scores and LinkedIn and Facebook. Obviously, as a student, one of the things you want to pay attention to, what kind of pictures you have of yourself on Facebook. And you get a bunch of pictures of yourself sitting around in drunken orgies, you're very likely not going to get hired, because people do check Facebook and LinkedIn. It's the easiest thing in the world. If you go to LinkedIn and someone has lied about their background or their degree, application goes in the garbage can. The validity of reference checking is fairly low, obviously. Letters of reference, the validity is relatively low. What you look for in a letter of reference is what is not said. I'm an academic, and basically I'm in charge of educating students, of producing new research, and doing service for the community and for my university. And so if someone wrote a letter of reference for me, you would expect it to have a discussion of teaching, a discussion of doing research, and a discussion of doing consulting and other kinds of service. And so if you got this letter and it talked highly about my teaching and about all the service that I did and didn't say anything about research, you would make the assumption from that letter of reference that I wasn't a very good researcher. So it's what's not in a letter of reference, not what is in the letter of reference, that is important. There's a lot of legal stuff, and you can read that about reference checking. The Fair Credit Reporting Act gets involved when you're checking, doing background checks and credit scores. You got to get permission. Okay, well, let's go on to personnel testing, because I'm going to run out of time with this tape. Testing is one of the biggest issues. There are different kinds of tests. You can read about them: cognitive and general mental ability tests, and tests of specific mental ability, like intelligence. There are tests that are work samples, like a typing test or a spelling test as a work sample. Can you really do something? And so there are achievement tests. There are tests that are based on aptitude, what you like to do or are most likely to do. And so there's lots of different kinds of tests, and people use them all over the place. Lots of use of personality tests in like the Myers-Briggs, in selecting leaders and managers, because you want to know how people get along with others, whether they have systemic skills that can see the big picture, and whether they're creative, etc. The bottom line is that testing has very low validity. You almost always need to use the test with something else, with an interview or with background checking. And you can't use a test by itself, because the validities tend to be in the 30s and 40s at the very highest. They're in the 40s with job performance tests. Can you actually do the job, like a typing test? But overall, there's a problem, is that if you give a manager a chance to do an interview where they rely on their own experience And to take the results of a test, they'll often take the results of a test which is a lower validity than if they just interviewed the candidate and asked pertinent questions for the particular job. So you have to be very careful about using testing. A lot of companies will use testing that's not been validated, that they cannot show is job related, and they'll be relying on someone else's testimony when in fact that's not legal because they don't have a meta-analysis. Most tests of specific mental ability are not useful unless you can very clearly prove that that specific mental ability is required on the job. I mean, obviously, clerical testing is fine for secretaries, typing testing. Mechanical comprehension is for mechanics. Intelligent is usually predictive of management and leadership jobs. So there are lots of things that can be done. It's just that it has to be job related. Are there racial differences in test performance? There are a ton, particularly in mental testing. African Americans tend to have lower scores than whites on a lot of cognitive ability tests. Hispanics fall midway. Men and women differ on performance tests. Men are stronger. Women have higher finger dexterity and hand coordination. So there's lots of difference across the protected classes by different kinds of testing. And you have to be very, very careful of that. If you throw a test in, you're very likely going to create underutilization of a minority. So you're going to have prima facie case of discrimination. And then if you don't have a validated test that you're using, you're behind the 8 ball and you'll lose a court case. There's really no clear-cut answer here, except that if you use a test, make sure that you validate it. Any selection instrument really should be validated. That's why there's so much use of performance exams or interviews, because they can be validated with content validity, which, remember, is a logical argument. It doesn't require a statistical wizard and an expert in testing to validate a test or an assessment center or an interview. You can simply lay out and say, here are the dimensions of the job as shown in our job analysis. Here are the questions or the aspects of this performance test. And it predicts there's a connection between the two. I have a reasonable sample of of the domain of the job. And so that logical argument becomes very, very important. The bottom line is that there are lots of ways to deal with different testing, for racial differences, and you can read about that section. You can remove culturally biased questions. You can have targeted recruitment. There's just a number of things you can do to fix those kinds of testing, or don't use them. The one thing I skipped over was physical and psychomotor testing, and there's a strong correlation between predicting accidents and injury with some testing. Physical ability tests may have adverse impact against women, as I already discussed, but they tend to be predictive as long as the activity is required on a job. That's what you have to be concerned about. I've been in an early age in a number of court cases that what was being measured was not required on the job. I mean, the post office required people to lift 100-pound sacks of mail and throw them in semi-trucks. Well, they don't do that. They put smaller sacks on pallets and use forklifts to run them into the truck. So there's lots of examples of using tests like that. The police used to do a test which was called the finger use test, finger pull test, when they all carried revolvers. It takes a lot of finger strength to fire a revolver, because you're actually pulling the revolver around and putting a new slug in place. And men can do that faster than women. And so they could rule women out by using the finger pull test. Trouble is, how many times do you empty your pistol into a suspect? I mean, most police officers rarely, if ever, fire their firearms, let alone use revolvers anymore. So just not a valid test. It doesn't validly connect to the criteria on the job. That's why job analysis is important. You got to know what the job is. You have to look at your test and make sure that it makes sense. Then you have to connect the two, either predictively or through content, and show that the test actually is predictive of the job. Um, the You can read the discussion about measuring personality and emotional intelligence and self-esteem and self-efficacy and locus of control and openness and flexibility and extroversion and introversion. There's a lot of things that can be measured about personality. Again, you have to connect personality to the job. That is not easy to do. It's easy to measure personality relatively accurately, but the validity of whether those personality traits are actually required to do the job is another story. And that's a very complex process, probably should be done by a consultant that understands testing and validation of tests. Um, but overall, what you should remember is the validity of testing is relatively low. Applicants can fake self-report instruments. Um, Most of the studies have had very small sample sizes, haven't been used in your industry. The relationship between personality and performance is at best curvilinear. It's not direct. Behavior is a much better predictor than is personality, and that's why you see tests that are performance tests like a typing test. Um, um, you can predict voluntary turnover, and there's a discussion of that. There are a number of questionnaires for doing that. You can predict employee theft. However, the Employee Polygraph Protection Act of 1998 banned the use of polygraphs for selection. That there was a number of articles that have shown that the polygraph is not a useful tool for pre-employment selection. It causes all kinds of problems. Um, there's a section about establishing a testing program, and you should study that carefully. You should understand the mental measurements yearbook. It's Burroughs, Buros. You can look it up. Our library has it. But it lists every test of mental measurements there is and shows you the validity studies behind it. So it's not hard to find this information. It's just that you've got to be careful when you use it so that you end up being able to show job relatedness. My advice is if you're going to get into mental measurement testing, you should hire someone that knows what they're doing, or make sure your HR officer does. Otherwise, use work samples. Measure what you know. You can see somebody doing the job. You can see that they've done it in the past. That's where application blanks and resumes are important. If they've done it in the past, it's a pretty good predictor that they'll do it in the future well. Another issue is drug testing. Drug abuse has been linked to all kinds of stuff: employee theft, accidents, absenteeism, turnover, counterproductive behavior, you name it. And so most companies do drug testing. It's mostly done with urine samples. Hair analysis can be used, but that gets more expensive. The test The modern tests can give you information on what kind of drugs used. And it's really easy. Pee in a cup, turn it upside down, shake it, and it'll even tell you what drugs being used. Drug testing is legal for pre-employment screening and on-the-job assessment. There are lots of state laws and a lot of collective bargaining agreements that restrict it, however. So you have to check that and make sure the state law or any kind of agreements you have with employees does not preclude it. there's a lot of discussion about whether testing is an invasion of privacy. Um, and you'll see, or you have seen in the EEO chapter, that you cannot use genetic testing because that is considered an invasion of privacy. But there are guidelines and standards for the confidentiality of drug testing, and for the most part, it is not considered um, a violation of individuals' privacy. It is, to some degree, it's invasive, but if they want the job, they're going to give permission to have a drug test. I talked about work sample testing, and the next section is about work sample testing. You should read that thoroughly. Simulations and work sample tests are significantly more valid than mental testing or cognitive testing in almost any regard. There's just a discussion of assessment centers, and they are the most valid form of selection. They're very expensive. They tend to only be used in higher level jobs or where there's no connection between the past job and the future job. Remember, I said that the past performance is the best predictor of future performance. So if you wanted to hire a nurse, then look at that nurse's performance in other nurse jobs in your organization or in other organizations, and it's probably a pretty good predictor of whether that nurse will do a good job at nursing. You might still measure some competencies, like do they know anything about quality improvement or computers or whatever. But nursing's nursing, and um, you can look at past nursing and predict future nursing for the most part. If you're going to hire that nurse to become a manager, however, what happens in most organizations is they pick the best nurse to make them the manager, and what they do is they lose a good practitioner and inherit a really lousy manager. That's because the skills that are required to be a nurse have nothing whatsoever to do with the skills that are required to be a manager. And so that's where assessment centers are used. You can come in and you can simulate management type activity, put a nurse into those simulations and see how she or he would behave, and then use the assessment center scores to predict whether that person would make a good manager. Assessment centers are basically several day affairs where people come in and do simulations, and they're judged based on a competency model and whether they can do the competencies of management or not. They're very specific, they're observable, they're verifiable. There's usually multiple measurement. They're just expensive. They're expensive and time consuming, but highly, highly, highly valid for selecting. But they'll only be used in high level positions, management or high level sales is the most common. And they're only used where you have no information prior to help select someone. But there's a discussion of typical assessment center exercises for management and where they're used and how defendable they are in court, etc. So that's kind of the testing side. You can use applications or resumes. There's all kinds of testing from mental ability to physical. There are work sample tests that go all the way up to assessment centers. You can test for specific things like lying or drugs. And they all have different validities. Assessment center is the highest. None of it's huge. None of it's really high. So you have to have some humility when it comes to testing. Sometimes your judgment's just as good as the typical test. And to the extent that you're judging based on multiple things, like an application bank, a resume, references, testing, watching that person do simulations, that judgment's going to be fairly valid. If you have multiple hurdle systems, the validity essentially increases. Now let's talk about interviewing. There's a large discussion of interviewing It is by far the most common personnel selection tool. It's cheap. It can be validated with content validity. It can be scored. It often is not scored, so there's not data hanging around to convict you with. But it has a fairly high validity if you use experienced managers to do the interviewing. Um, you obviously need to know what the job is. You need to know how to interview. You need to not you need to be taught what the mistakes are and how not to make the mistakes. You shouldn't stereotype, for instance. You shouldn't believe that fat people are slow and can't get their work done. That's stereotyping. Um, there are lots of rating biases that occur. If they look like you, you'll like them more. If a very if a very if a mod if you interview someone who's not good and then you interview someone who's moderately good, you'll actually see that moderately good person higher than they really would be. If you take a moderately good person and interview them after a very good person, you'll see those people lower. That's a contrast effect. So there are a number of errors that can be made in interviewing, and you can teach managers to not do them. It's not hard. So you almost always have some kind of interviewing training to get rid of rating biases and situational attributes and stereotyping and that sort of thing. You usually are going to teach managers to use an interview guide too. It's best to write the questions down that you're going to ask an applicant because it's very hard to think up complex work sample questions. If you don't want to ask questions about with yes or no answers, you don't want to say, did you do fine on that job? Because what's the answer going to be? Yes, I did great on that job. What you really want to ask are work sample questions like if you had an Excel spreadsheet up on your computer and you wanted to do a radar gram out of the data that was in your spreadsheet, how would you go about doing that? That's a work sample question, and you're going to get a fairly good answer about whether that person knows how to do it or not. And so those kinds of questions are tough to think about on the fly. And they also, you would probably think of different ones. You probably would think up what happened to you on the job last week. Um, and so it's best to start an interview guide and keep adding those kinds of questions to it. It's also good because you can look at the interview guide and you can use it for content validity. You can put a job description next to it and say, okay, here's the questions we're asking in the interview guide. And you see they relate almost one-to-one to the competencies that are required on a job. That's your logical argument for content validity. So there's lots of biases and a lot of errors in interviewing that take away from the validity, but you can also increase the validity by using interview guides and developing really good questions based on the competencies of the required in the job, and particularly writing work sample type questions. Really looking, it's called behavioral interviewing, but a lot of what would you do in this situation? How do you do this? Those kinds of questions. There's a section on how to improve the validity of interviews, standardize the process, use interview guides, do comprehensive interview training, look at the interview content, make sure it's job related, avoid biased language and encourage note taking. If you interview 5 people, I guarantee you'll forget all about the first 2 by the time you get to the 5th. So it's best, one of the things that's nice about an interview guide is you spread the questions out in Xerox an interview guide for each candidate and write notes on it. Just don't write biased notes on it. But then you can go back and you can look at your notes across candidates who you might have interviewed across 2 weeks. And you can actually say, okay, here are the questions I ask, and here are the answers, and you've got all the data in front of you, and you can make very accurate. Accurate's not the right word. You can make very valid decisions on who's the best candidate. Because remember, out of that, you're only going to get the best candidate out of the 5. You're not going to be, this is the best candidate forever for this job. It's just out of these 5 that we got down to this is the best one. There's lots of different kinds of interviews, and you can read about them. I advocate structured interviews, but people use group or panel interviews or situational or behavioral interviews. You should structure your interview. You should use lots of behavioral work sample questions. Don't ask closed-ended questions. If you want to know why you shouldn't use closed-ended questions, go interview a little kid. Little kids are very empathetic. And if you say, did you have fun in school? Guess what the little kid's going to say? He's going to say yes. And you're after about 10 questions like that, where the little kid's saying yes or no, because they're answering exactly like you questioned them, you're going to get really frustrated. And you start to learn with little kids to ask a lot of open-ended questions and work sample questions, like tell me what you did today. Even then, the kid might say, well, not much. But then you move it even further to what did you have the most fun doing today? And so you can see that you're working from closed-ended to open-ended to really work sample questions. What did you do? And how did you do it? And so just go practice on a little kid, and that'll get you asking open question work sample questions very quickly. The bottom line is it's behavioral, it's more valid than mental testing. It's easy to do, it's cheap to validate. It's by far the most common thing. You should get good at it, and you should develop interview guides for the different jobs that you're going to select people for. Can keep your good questions. One of the problems that happens with managers is that you only interview somebody maybe every once a year or 6 months, and so you forget all about interviewing. You can't go through training every time you go interview somebody. So write yourself an interview guide for a secretary and for a subordinate position that you supervise, and throw it on your desk, and then pull it out and study it before you interview. It'll be interesting that you find yourself significantly better at the process. Now, there is a section about combining data from various selection methods. That's essentially what you're going to do in almost all cases. You are going to have what's called a multiple hurdle system, that you have to pass one step before you go on to the next step. You may have just a multiple system where you do 3 or 4 things and then you combine the data. If that's the case, then you need to have some kind of formal method for analyzing that data in a holistic sense. And so if you don't do more multiple hurdle and you do have multiple items in your selection system, you need to come up with a formalized method of weighting the scores from the different methods, either equal weighting or weight the scores based on their empirical validity, or mathematically combine the scores in some way. Whatever, you need to have a method that's the same for every candidate, because that can cause disparate impact. If you have a multiple hurdle system, you don't get interviewed, or you don't go to the second step until you get through the first step. And as long as you've got valid cutoffs at each step, that's fine. It gets complicated. Again, that's why you probably need an expert to design your selection system. But you don't want to have anything that's in there, any step that's in there that causes disparate impact, because then the whole burden of proof shifts to you. Sorry about that. The burden shifts to you. Hold on for just a second, take a break. Anyway, if you have anything in there that causes disparate impact, the burden is going to shift to you, and you're going to have a hard time showing that you did validate your selection instruments, or you did validate your data combination method. And so all of that is difficult. There's a section on overseas assignments and selection there, and selection in other countries, and you can read that if you're interested in it. All countries are different. Korea uses a lot of tests. Japan hires directly from universities. The French do a lot of handwriting analysis, which is valid, by the way. You just have to validate it. It is valid that you can tell personality by handwriting, But the problem is the connection between personality and a job. That's a double set predictive validity. And so it's like the polygraph. The polygraph is a relatively valid instrument for telling whether you had physiological reaction. But the question is did you that physiological reaction because you were lying or not? So again, those are complex issues that you should bring experts into. The bottom line, you've got to define the job. You've got to go back to the chapter on work analysis. You've got to define the job, and particularly the job specifications for selection. You need to recruit from the broadest pool of applicants you can find that likely have the job skills that you have. You have to have proven valid screening instruments. You should do background and reference checking. You should have an interview guide if you do interviewing and do behavioral interviewing techniques. You should develop a schema for weighting all of the information or do multiple hurdle or either. And then extend offers. And then, of course, we're going to go into other chapters, but the data collection doesn't end there. Then you have to find out who stayed and who did a good job and etc. So that's a very quick 50-minute discussion of selection. It is a complex process, but read the chapter. Call me if you have any questions.